Hello and welcome to Taiwan Today. I am Natalie So. I'm honored to have with me a renowned expert on Taiwan and China, Mr. Tkacik. He's the director of the Future Asia Project at the International Assessment and Strategy Center in Washington, D.C. He's been invited to Taiwan by the Taiwan think tank. And he's an expert on U.S.-China relations as well. Most recently in U.S.-China relations, there's been a truce on this trade war, a 3-month truce. What do you take about this? What do you think is happening in U.S.-China relations with this deal?
I always have this suspicion that there's something going on under the surface that we're not quite aware of.
I'm sure
and I'm not
is.
sure that Washington is aware of it, but there's an awful lot of interest, I think, in Washington and especially in Taipei in moving forward with a free trade agreement with Taiwan.
Really?
And I think that, and you can, you know,
That's
this
good
is
news for Taiwan.
I just hear this, and I think China is all of a sudden using this new opening and this Tingjan, or what do you call it, Shoubing or whatever, this ceasefire to see if they can get America's mind off of Taiwan and focus back on the benefits of China. But this has to happen immediately. These Chinese concessions have to be resolved today. Today, Monday,
like
Tuesday.
he had a long list.
Yeah.
I know Trump had a long list of all intellectual property and cyber theft and a long list of requests that he says they got to be
non-tariff barriers and
be settled by
high tariffs on automobiles. Already, China sells 40,000 Buicks from Chinese factories across the Pacific Ocean into U.S. auto showrooms.
Really?
And that's 40,000 a year. We can't export that to China. They have a 40% tariff. And I think President Trump said, get rid of all of that tariff tomorrow. Because that's a.
I wish they'd do that to Taiwan. We have big tariffs here.
Well, that's
but,
it. Maybe,
that's another
perhaps,
issue.
Yeah. But I mean, the point is that I think this all has to take place in the next 3 months. There are certain demands that have to be met immediately. Over the next 3 months, we have to see a complete movement on China's cyber attacks, China's technology theft. A complete about face on half a dozen other economic and trade issues that China has been pressuring American businesses with. And people say, well, look, you know, this is a 25% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese exports to the United States. But 25% tariff on $200 billion is $50 billion. And that $50 billion is less than the Chinese trade surplus with the United States in September.
Right.
And so $50 billion is
nothing,
peanuts
really,
as far as they're concerned. And the other way that the Chinese get around it, of course, is that they devalue the yuan. And by devaluing the yuan, they basically make up for the cost difference, the 25% cost difference. So if the Trump administration does not see immediate changes in that, I think that by the end of the 90 days, it'll be over. Now, just yesterday, we had the U.S. Commerce Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for, one of the Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Commerce for Manufacturing and Industry, who's primarily interested in I think a lot of the technology cooperation between Taiwan and the United States and Taiwan and China. And I think there's a serious interest in Commerce Department about resolving a lot of our problems with Taiwan.
So do you think, you had mentioned earlier that China is making concessions because they're afraid of U.S. and Taiwan relations. Do you think that's a major factor, or is just...
Well, there's an old joke about, Poland in the Second World War when they had a scientific conference on elephants, and the Germans did the encyclopedia of the elephant, and the British did the class structure of the elephants, and the French did the love and mating habits of the elephant, and the Poles came up with the elephants and the Polish question, which means every time I look at something, I think of it in a Taiwan view.
Right, we do, of course. We're in Taiwan.
This is U.S.-China trade
from a Taiwan perspective.
From the Taiwan perspective.
Right.
But I do see that Taiwan is a factor in that, as far as the Chinese are concerned. I don't know that, I mean, I haven't talked to people yet, but I don't know that Washington is quite putting the two together. But it's clear that in 1992, I think it was 1992, anyway, the early 90s, Taiwan had already signed on the dotted line for the working group for WTO entry. And China and the United States was also dealing with China, and China was hemming and hawing and stretching out and for years we were trying to get the Chinese to fulfill the working group obligations. And finally in 2000, in the last year of the Clinton administration told China, well, regardless of whether you sign on the dotted line for WTO, we're going to bring in Taiwan customs territory into the WTO, whether China's in or not. And China all of a sudden said, "Oh, well, we can resolve this. Our only concern is that we can do it as quickly as you want. Our only concern is that we get in before Taiwan." And so as soon as China signed on the dotted line and was part of the WTO, within a day, Taiwan was a part of the WTO.
So it seems that Taiwan plays this very special role in the relationship between U.S. and China. I mean, it's very sensitive on China's end. Would you call it, some people call it a bargaining chip or leverage, or can you describe the role that you think that Taiwan is playing in U.S.-China relations?
This is a new phenomenon. For the last 40 years, the United States has consciously, and I know this because I was in the government, rejecting the use, eschewing the use of Taiwan as a bargaining chip with China. That we would never deal with Taiwan in a bargaining situation with China. There were a couple of minor incidents in the 80s where China was getting very upset about our arms sales to Taiwan. And the U.S. then said, well, I'll tell you what, we will open up we'll expand arms transfers to China. How do you feel about that? And once we started opening up arms transfers, or at least defense transfers of equipment and technology to China in the early 80s, the Chinese didn't raise Taiwan anymore. We went through and completed a number of significant arms deals with Taiwan. But aside from that, the U.S. government has rejected the idea of using Taiwan as a bargaining chip. The Trump administration has come in, and President Trump himself, I assume it's President Trump because nobody else in the government, maybe Dr. Navarro or Ambassador Lighthizer, sees it differently. And I'm sure that Ambassador Bolton sees this differently. But President Trump says, we have this leverage. Why don't we use it with China? And President Trump over the last year and a half, has realized that whenever he uses Taiwan, he gets what he wants from the Chinese. The problem that he's facing now is that when he gets what he wants from the Chinese, after 6 or 7 months, the Chinese renege on it, or they've forgotten what they've promised, or whatever. So this whole deal with, President Tsai Ing-wen called President Trump to congratulate President-elect Trump, to congratulate him on his election. The Chinese got all upset about it. And President Trump wrote a tweet. He said, well, over the last 10 years, we've purchased, the Taiwanese have purchased $14 billion in arms from the United States. Why can't I talk to the president of Taiwan on the phone? It seems perfectly. And it was.
And he said, President of Taiwan.
Well, the other thing is that right after that, the Chinese harassed our naval ships in the South China Sea, cutting a sonar drone from one of our destroyers, and then pretending that it somehow was a danger to navigation. And President Trump President-elect Trump took a very hardline position on that. So by the time it came around to February and President Trump wanted certain trade issues and wanted progress on North Korea, all of a sudden Xi Jinping was his best friend. I don't think President Trump is, I don't think he's bamboozled by President Xi's protestations of friendship and cooperation. But he knows how to leverage that into a commitment. And the Chinese have never seen a president do this before, where the Chinese say one thing, President Trump says, the Chinese promised me everything, and now if the Chinese don't give him everything, he says, the Chinese stabbed me in the back. With North Korea, at the early part of this year, you'll find that we had this great opening relationship with North Korea. Excuse me. And when Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un flew to Dalian and had a meeting, and then Xi Jinping flew to Pyongyang and had a meeting, and then Xi Jinping then took the train to Beijing and had another meeting, and then shows up in Singapore and basically doesn't come through on his promises. President Trump says personally, he says, the Chinese are stabbing me in the back. This is the Chinese doing. And that the Chinese have never seen this before. They do it all the time. But so I think as far as Taiwan's concerned, President Trump sees Taiwan as leverage in a way that no other American administration has seen Taiwan as leverage. That's not a bargaining chip, but it means leveraging our relationship with Taiwan up and up and up until China gives us what we want. And if China gives us what we want, then we'll sort of keep it at that level until China reneges again, and then we'll lever it up and up and up again. So last summer, when the Chinese were interfering in the North Korean issue, all of a sudden you had the White House issue a statement on China's Orwellian nonsense
with all the commercial
flights
pressure,
on Taiwan.
Right.
And then right after the Salvadorians broke relations with the Republic of China, you never saw this before.
It's
The president recalled 3 ambassadors to discuss where we were going to go with these countries that weren't going to listen to us regarding Taiwan.
Right.
And I think the Chinese got the message, but they still didn't believe it. And I think what you see now, we've seen the most substantive expansion of U.S.-Taiwan relations in the last 40 years in this past year. And I think the president is satisfied that this is an effective leverage,
right, to getting through to China. And
getting through to China.
So do you think that this means, going back to our first question, that China will meet all the demands of the U.S. in this U.S. trade issue?
This is another. President Trump, I'm not sure, is interested in China meeting our demands.
Really?
I think what President Trump is he wants China to show itself as a hostile, aggressive economic power that is damaging the U.S. economy. He doesn't want China to meet any demands.
Well, then what's the good of that, though? Doesn't he want China to change,
because
right?
Because he wants to rebuild America's manufacturing and industrial infrastructure. And you can't do that with China dominating the global resource markets. China's the world's biggest trading power. China's the world's biggest manufacturing power by a great margin. The United States is finding itself, and realizes this more than anybody, with a dwindling industrial infrastructure that cannot be rebuilt without a full buy-in by the U.S. Congress and the U.S. electorate. And this is what he ran for president on 2 years ago, which is, I'm going to rebuild America's industrial base. I'm going to bring jobs back from overseas to the United States. And one of the things that really has enraged him in the last 2 weeks is the idea that the Chinese are selling Buicks into the United States market, with General Motors then saying, we're going to close our factories in America and move them either just stop selling those things altogether, or move the factories to
China?
No, to Mexico.
Mexico.
And the idea that the Chinese now have an open entry to U.S. auto markets, where the United States doesn't have it, it's just
that's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. It just sends him around the bend,
right.
And he's using Taiwan, I think, in this context as leverage. And he doesn't want, like I say, he doesn't want China to really come through. In fact, what he wants China to do is to backstab him. He wants China to show that it's not a reliable partner. And so we'll see. I think China is not in a position to come through on all of its promises made at the G20 day before yesterday. So we'll see what happens. But you heard it here first.
Well, thanks so much, John, for your thoughts. Very insightful and interesting. Thanks for being on our show. I've been speaking with a renowned expert on Taiwan and China, John Tkacik. He's the director of the Future Asia Project at the International Assessment and Strategy Center in Washington. I'm Natalie So. Thanks for tuning in to Taiwan Today. Thanks for tuning in.